So, can we put my slides up? Where's that? Here. Oh.
Right here. This place.
Here too? Okay.
Not yet. Check 1, 2. Oh, I'm working. Yes. Alex, we still cannot hear you. So.
Oh, should I wait? Can you turn on the microphone?
Yeah.
Don't touch.
Okay. Now, is it working? Okay.
Does it work for you?
Sorry? You want me to stop? No. Okay. So which?
Okay, let's.
Take time. Yep.
So sorry for that. It's not augmented reality yet.
Yeah. Just smile, Alex.
Hello? Yeah, I guess that's working. Perfect. Hi. Nice to meet you. Ed, could you hand me this? Thanks. So I'm going to talk about medical virtual reality. My experience with virtual reality and augmented reality, thank you very much, goes back to 1999. I created an MIT spin-off called Charmed that was the pioneer in making wearable computers with augmented reality. And I did the first commercial augmented reality for Rock and Roll Act. It was for Duran Duran Pop Trash Tour. So this book is the first book on 4G, wireless broadband, and I wrote it in 2001, and in it there's a whole section on augmented reality. I find it very amusing that augmented reality and virtual reality are seen as new because they were around for a while even when I was doing it commercially. And part of the reason that I'm here to give this talk today is I have a new book that I co-authored that is in Korean language. It's called Augmented: Life in the Smart Lane. I wrote it with Brett King and 2 other authors, and there's a lot in the book about augmented reality. I highly recommend it. If you like the talk, I recommend getting the book and reading more about it. Is it working? No. Okay. Right. Sorry. Great. Korea is a world leader in consumer electronics, so I have complete confidence in your products here today. So I'm going to talk about medical virtual reality, which is what I think is the most exciting way to transform healthcare. In the United States, healthcare, by some estimates, is a $3 trillion business. By other estimates, one including Peter Diamandis, it's $4.8 trillion a year. Korea has a very intelligent government for ICT policy. It's made you world leaders in many areas. And Korea has a goal, which I'll talk about in a minute, but you have a global goal of 5% of the global VR market for services by 2025. I believe that this is the best way to achieve this goal. I was given the great opportunity to talk about VR. The reason I'm focusing on this is because, as you'll see, the numbers, the amount of money that can be made here are huge, wonderful, and I know that people are here in part because they want to know how to make money for their companies or save money for their government agencies. So, what's medical VR? What's VR? What are the market opportunities? Why is it happening now if it's been around for decades? What are the big applications? What are the technology trends? What's the summary? That's what we're going to cover here today. And what is it? Well, it's a digital replication of a realistic 3D, 4D, 5D world with interaction. It's multi-sensory. It involves the vision, it involves audio, and early VR examples, they found that the sound, especially surround sound, so that the sound would change depending on which direction you were looking at or moving in, was half of the perception of verisimilitude, of reality. And it's ideal for deep learning. So you can learn twice as fast using VR if you have it done right. Also, the 360-degree sound surround and the high refresh rate so that you have a high frame rate, high resolution. These things all add to the sense of immersion, of being there. And the headsets and controllers can optimize interactivity. So let's just look at a quick example of hardware. So we have Google Cardboard, HTC Vive Pre, we have LG 360 VR, Oculus Rift, Samsung Gear, Sony PlayStation. Now, I think it's very interesting because these are sort of the national flagships. To me, this is how people will get to know nations. The way that Brazil wanted to get the world to know Brazil is by having the Olympics. And you have your VR. I would put all the money you can into VR because that is going to create the best impression of a national technology capability of any technology that's ever existed, with the exception of maybe the automobile. So, what can we see from Korea? Well, for one thing, the resolution is the highest resolution of the devices that are on the market. Good job. And also, it has it's equal to the biggest field of view. It's got not as many sensors for things. It's got as many controls or more than other things, and it's working on Android. And so those are basically, Korea is well positioned in this market to start with. Now, how big a market are we talking about? Well, within medical VR, there are 4 really big markets. There's, this is just for the US, and the US is about, depending on how you look at it, about 18 to 22% of world GDP. So you can take each of these numbers and multiply it by 3 to 5, and you find the global market. And Korea is very smart about addressing global markets right from the start. So one really big market is the market for weight loss. Koreans have one of the lowest rates of obesity in the world. You have only about 3% of people who are obese or overweight. In America, 78% of people are overweight and 38% of people are obese. So I give you this because this is not the kind of thing that you would think of, but it's like to help people to lose weight is something that's actually very, very useful to people in America. And if we continue trends, if it doesn't reverse, everybody on Earth will be obese by 2065. And no nation has gone backwards once it started on the obesity pathway. Smoking cessation is a $528 billion a year opportunity. That's enormous. Addiction is $181 billion, and that's just for drugs, because if we look below that, alcohol is $223 billion. That's a big market. In the United States, we have almost as many people who are addicts of drugs and alcohol, almost as many people as you have in South Korea, in the Republic of Korea. So we have 40.2 million people who are addicts. This is absolutely vital, and as we'll see in a minute, we have a huge failure rate, and we've got to change that. Chronic pain. Donald Trump gave a speech in New Hampshire about Americans. 5% of Americans we're about 5% of the world's population, but we consume more than 80% of the opioid painkillers. I wrote that speech for him, so it's very meaningful to me, and I hope it will become a big part of his new administration. Stroke, people having a blood vessel burst in their brain, is 86 billion. Post-traumatic stress, because the U.S. cannot help itself of sending people into battle, into conflict, but also police, because our police are armed, they shoot people, they have people shooting at them, firefighters, and so on. Post-traumatic stress is a $300 billion market. And then autism, I think Korea has the highest rate of autism for children in the world. I think it's 1 in 50. So I would hope that you would become experts in this and help people with that. So let's talk about Korea's market. First of all, Korea has identified virtual reality, including specifically medical training, as a strategic industry. And the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy cited total VR market as being $128 billion by 2018. That's going to start in about 13 and a half, 14 months. So it's happening now and it's going to explode. And the MOTI is investing 70 million euros in related projects. So as I said before, Korea's goal is to reach 5% of the global market for VR training. This is very doable if you focus on medical VR, because that's where people have the money to spend on it. And then I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Korea is already ahead of every other government. You're the government that has most clearly and intelligently identified the rapidly growing VR market. And wherever the government says, there's money here, we want you to be a leader, more times than not, Korea becomes the leader. That's why I believe in Korea. And you've started investing government money to seed the area. Also, you have a great partnership. You have Samsung, one of the best companies in the world with consumer electronics, and you all have a partnership with Oculus and Facebook. Facebook has 1.7 billion users, and it has Mark Zuckerberg, who's crazy about virtual reality. He loves it, and he spent $2 billion on a company that just 2 years earlier raised $2 million in a Kickstarter, Palmer Luckey's company. So, Gear VR has over 1 million users. That's a good start. The bad news is, not that bad, but competition is very high, and it includes Sony's PlayStation VR and Taiwan's HTC Vive. In addition, and this is where NDA stuff is coming, Alex is the most knowledgeable person in the building about this. I don't know what he can say about it, but there's a lot of the economy in Korea is built on displays and electronics, and there's a trend towards vaporization of consumer electronics and doing away with it. So you can't necessarily count on markets for big screens and 4K and 8K screens if people are just going to have something projected on the retina. It's a dematerialization, what Buckminster Fuller called ephemeralization. Ephemeralization is taking a cable that weighs millions of tons spread around the world, a copper cable with perchiguda, rubber, and stuff, and then just replacing it with a 90-pound satellite. So that kind of process is relentless and continuing, and you've got to get ahead of it. And that means you have to be really good at content. So I'd listen very carefully to what my friend and colleague Ed Lance has to say, because he's very knowledgeable about content. He lives right in a center of content creation in Los Angeles, which is sort of the content creation capital of the world. So in conclusion, I think Korea should increase the priority of VR, increase the funding, and really go for more partnerships, because you can't depend entirely on Facebook and Oculus. Otherwise, it's very difficult to reach those goals because everybody's going to want to be a leader in it. So, medical VR. Why and why now? Well, there's over 30 years of VR research in medical and health learning, and so we have a mountain of evidence that if you see at the end of my presentation, I'm going to bet that there are more references at the end of my presentation. I won't read them, but I'll just show you, than all the other presentations put together. This is an extremely well-researched, scientific, documented field. Now, here's the big reason. If you remember nothing, remember this. VR headsets in 2001 cost up to $100,000. You know, what is that in won? What's that, 100 million won? Is that it? Yeah, 100 million won. And now, $600 you can get a headset, and soon that cost will collapse into nothing because you won't even have a headset. So the costs are going from $100,000 to nearly zero. Also, the industry growth, medical health VR can leverage the growth of medical work in general. And there are healthcare challenges. The costs are rising enormously. Now, your costs are not as much, but in the United States, which is your biggest market, anybody know what we spend on average per person for healthcare? Does anyone know? Any of our Korean friends know? Anybody want to guess? Okay, it's $13,000 per person per year. So, something with VR, if you can help somebody to solve their problems, has enormous multiplier effects because the marginal cost of the production is very, very low. Also, drug and substance abuse is increasing. There hasn't been a year for a very long time that we had fewer addicts one year than we had the next year. And there's a lot of demand to get people out of hospitals and into their homes. And there's also the issue of elder care. You want to treat people in their homes and not in very costly hospital beds. So, the first application is training. There's medical training because the CATs and the fMRI and telesurgery, it's difficult, it's bloody, it's gross, it's expensive. And so if you can have VR, you have the equivalent of a flight simulator instead of having an airplane. And plastic models or photos aren't realistic, and they don't give you the same sense of feedback or proportion. And finally, a lot of really complex value-added surgeries are done by teams. And how do you train a team to get together? They're not all going to be in the same place at the same time. They might not even be in the same country. But if everybody is sharing a VR simulation, they can all be trained at the same time to be working as a team. Then we have also the training for psychological therapy. So it's very difficult to train people to be counseling for drug addicts. Now, if you combine VR with something that you've seen world experts here at this conference, you've been very lucky, with AI, then you have two different things. One is where you have the clinician, the therapist, with an AI patient. And the other is where you have the patient with an AI doctor. Those are two kinds of things. And you have now AI and sensors that can detect, sort of you can see that face there, it looks like something from The Walking Dead. They detect the patient's facial expression, the speech and audio, the body language, and all of these kind of things. And you can see the mood that someone is in. And you can detect something that Harv Eker has been looking at, which are micro expressions. So the computer can catch things that are too fast for the human eye to catch and to perceive, but the computer can see it all. And DARPA is funding this. DARPA is a $5 billion a year agency that does things for the military. Another thing is that the cost of medical to rise. Whatever you decide about American politics, Obamacare has done one thing that's not disputable, and that is it has increased the demand and it has reduced supply. So only 18,000 new doctors graduate from medical school in the United States each year, and we have 1 million doctor shortage that we will have by 2025. So we are going to have telemedicine. We're going to have to open up Cuba to medical tourism. That's something I've been working on. But basically, and we also have an aging population. This is something that we share with Korea, we share with China, we share with Japan, we share with Germany, Italy. So we're going to need to deal with that. And finally, we have a lot more people who are sad. They have a substance addiction disorder. We want to have people being able to do telesurgery. So you have some doctors who are specialists in certain kinds of surgery, and you don't want them wasting all their time flying on airplanes. If they can go into VR and be in their home surgical den and do these surgeries, that's very, very useful. And finally, you want to have doctors talking to people on a follow-up basis, and so a doctor can just VR into someone's home. So the patient can stay at home, and the doctor can stay at his home or her home, and it's much easier and cheaper. In the United States, we have a big problem with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's 12 million people have been driven a little bit crazy by having too much stress. And as I said, it's not just soldiers, it's also firefighters and so on. And VR exposure therapy has proven to be very useful. Now, the traumas that we have published medical evidence that it's treated are fear of flying, fear of heights, fear of spiders, and also many memories of childhood abuse. There are some people who think that up to 1/3 of girls are abused or molested, and this causes problems later because they sometimes kind of block it out, but it sort of stays in the subconscious. And there's also the issue, I don't know if you have it in Korea, but you're similar enough to Japan, of the sarariman dropping dead from overwork, exhaustion, being in nervousness. I had a good conversation with my friend Bill this morning about lobsters. Lobsters don't really age, but there aren't a lot of old lobsters. And part of the reason is because that the octopus are always trying to get them. So they live their lives in a state of fear. And when they get too big, then they can't hide and they're killed. Well, we live our lives in high-stress business environments. Like right now in Korea, you're not sure if your head of state will be here in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. You don't know about where you're going to be with your industry. Is the United States going to still be a reliable military partner? And all that stuff. You live under the threat of artillery bombardment from North Korea that can obliterate the city in 3 days. I mean, it's understandable if you are feeling stress, and VR can help with that. So, also, one of the most amazing things, because the United States is consuming so many drugs for pain, is in a $666 billion a year pharmaceutical market, we consume half. We spend half of that money on the drugs. And I really want to make a stand and say that in many cases, we have the power of mind that with VR, we can manage the pain through our thinking and through the VR and not have to get addicted to opiate drugs. So you have the VR programs attenuating pain, and we've known this for more than a decade. We can reduce distress during things such as chemotherapy. And there's a game called Snow World and also one Free Dive. And if you look at this brain, I'm not sure if this is going to, is this a light? Okay. Is there a pointer? Does the pointer work here? Okay. So if you look at that brain there, that part that's yellowish green, that's a person feeling pain. They're suffering. They're in agony. But then that same person with no drugs, but with virtual reality, has been able to reduce the pain and decrease it. And I think that our purpose on earth has to include reducing suffering for as many people as possible. And if you can reduce suffering without addicting to drugs, I think you have to promote that and let people know that. And then we also have the problem of drug addiction. Now, I'm working on something called the Lightman Stargate Protocol for addictive disorders. It's my own way of treating drug disorders. This is a problem that's very, very meaningful and important to me. We have found that over 90% of the time someone goes into drug rehabilitation, they return to using drugs. It's more than a 90% failure rate. It's one of the worst things. And in the United States, it can cost up to $100,000 per month per person for drug treatment that fails 9 times out of 10. But you have 3 things that are part of every single addictive disorder, and VR can help with every single one of them. So the first is executive function, the inability to see the long-term consequences of your actions. You have the idea in Korea. Is it pali pali? You have that speed up, yes? So you actually are becoming a culture. The good side of Korea is that you are of the highest average IQ in the world. That's why you're going to be successful no matter what. You also have some of the fastest reaction times in the world. So a typical human reaction time is 500 to 700 milliseconds. But because your networks are so fast and they have the least latency, you have become to have a faster reaction time. And my research indicates that a faster reaction time is like a boost in IQ. So if I ask a question of people in a class, or a teacher does, a person with a faster reaction time can answer. It looks like IQ. If you want to see more, there's a TV show on the Science Channel you can find called Alien Encounters 3, and the first episode is all about this. It's about how you speed up the human reaction time. So the second thing after that, with executive function, you can show someone the longer-term consequences and say, if you keep on using drugs, here is the story of your life from beginning to end. And they might think, oh my gosh, now I see that. And also a negative emotionality. It can increase your ability to be positive. And it's what's called incentive salience. It's an overvaluing an immediate reward. It's saying that a reward you get right now is more important than one later. We have a test that we do in America called the marshmallow test, where you give a child a marshmallow, and you put it in front of them, you said the kid wants the marshmallow, and they say, you can have the marshmallow now if you want, or you can wait 5 minutes and you can have 2 marshmallows. And the children who can wait for the marshmallow, the one who basically can wait, have much greater success in life. And so you can train people in this way to overcome cravings, overcome the desire to forget about everything else and just get high right now. And then we have VR for inpatient intensive things. You can reduce the pain, detect their mood, manage it, increase their motivation, and show them how to reduce risky behaviors. Like if they're allergic to something, how to make sure that they avoid that. Or if there's iatrogenic effects or drug interactions, teach them about that. You can help people with training how to do things, how to change their bed or change their bandages or all the stuff that you want to do. And then you can also have things for performance improvement. You can increase your focus, increase your motivation, which is the good stress with biofeedback. You can reduce tension and distraction, the bad stress, the one that leads to cortisol. One of the limiters on our life is the size and efficacy of our thymus. The thymus is up here. It's like a small strawberry the size when we're a teenager. But when you hit puberty and you have estrogen if you're a woman, or testosterone if you're a man, or if you have cortisol comes from stress, from overwork, then it shrinks your thymus, and then you have a weakened immune system, and you're more likely to die of the flu or something like that. You have proven increases using these new biofeedback in mental and physical performance, as proven in the military. And then we have also sports and fitness, since basically I'm going to make sure that I stay within my time, but this is now being used in a lot of sports things. And of course, people who are doing esports, in effect, they're doing VR all the time. When, Korea has the best StarCraft 2 players and other people. And resilience training. So we were talking about this. It's called SIT, Stress Inoculation Training. It identifies vulnerabilities to certain kinds of stress and then teaches you, kind of like getting an inoculation of like chickenpox or measles or something, how to manage that stress. It's like, oh yeah, I normally, lose it and get terrified when this happens. Like public speaking is a big fear for people. You can get someone used to it, so when that happens, they go, I now will make myself calm. I will breathe. I will go into it because you've had that training. And this is another thing that the military has done to reduce burnout. This is the kind of thing that can increase productivity, long-term productivity for Korean companies. And we have, what are the trends? Well, wearable sensors are coming up. The sensors are going to measure and record biological and physical measures from this. We heard yesterday from our delightful colleague from IBM that we are each producing 300 million books worth of health data. So this is along that line. Heart rate variability, your EEG, your electroencephalogram, which is brain waves, emotional states. We have an explosion of companies in the United States working on sleep. Sleep is the big area for consumer electronics, at least that my friends are trying to pursue. Blood glucose, new handheld displays. So summarizing, medical and health VR offers an exploding market. There are application areas for training, telemedicine, telesurgery, mental health behavior therapy, performance improvement. It's amazing how much you can get out of this. There's an enormous potential for Korea. The world is yours right now, as long as you can become really good at content. But you need more funding, including funding from the government, funding from venture capitalists, funding from within Samsung and other companies. You have to prioritize it and see, we want to be the #1 in the world at medical VR because of all the adjacencies, and you need to have many more partnerships to reach the global market. So here are my references. As you can see, all these books and white papers and stuff went into making this presentation. So this is boiling down probably 10,000 pages of information. I hope it's been useful. Thank you very much for your time. 감사합니다.
So, thank you, Alex. Great.